On today, December 10th, 2020, we, just as legions of fans across the world, were devastated by the news of the passing of Richard Corben a week ago on December 2nd. In tribute to this monumental creator, we wanted to represent an episode dedicated to Corbin from our archives. Originally broadcast on April 17th, 2015, this episode was for a segment that we called Shine On, spotlighting artists who may not have been widely appreciated and unsung as household names, so to speak. And Corbin was obviously beyond worthy. Please enjoy our humble retrospective on Corbin's career and art that broadened, titillated, and ultimately inspired the imaginations of generations of fans and artists worldwide. For more episodes, be sure to subscribe to sidebarforever.com or wherever you get your podcast.
Welcome back to Sidebar, and welcome back to the greatest art literate talk and the most Corbin-centric talk you have ever heard.
Yes.
My name is Swain. I am one of the hosts of the show.
I am Dwight Clark, and I'm the host of the show.
And I'm Adrian Johnson, the other host of the show.
Welcome to, again, another episode of Sidebar. This one is going to be a shine-on episode, and we are shining a very bright and a very vibrant spotlight upon the talents of one Richard Corben.
Indeed.
He is the man. He is definitely an unsung talent, and he is definitely a favorite of ours and a favorite of many of yours, as we are sure. And we're definitely going to celebrate him on this particular episode of Shine On. Again, for the uninitiated, just a little bit about Richard Corben. This is a part of a bio that's on his website that was written by a guy named George Walter, and I'm not going to read the entire thing verbatim, but I'm just going to kind of skip over it, just to give you a little taste of his background and where he comes from and where he is now. Richard Corben was born in Missouri, and he grew up in Sunflower, Kansas, which is a workforce community. He's been drawing comics all of his life, and he's been interested in drawing all of his life. An early effort drawing a series of comics was about the adventures of Trail, the family dog, which I thought was kind of funny. He later moved on to Tarzan and Brothers of the Spear, but he's always had an interest in comics and animation and so forth. In art college, he concentrated on basic drawing and painting, developed the skills, and decided that he wanted to move to New York and try to launch a career in comics and animation. But he was always a very shy guy. He wasn't a very overt person. So he put off such a drastic move and decided that he was going to work in construction with his father for a while. And he found a local job working for an animation company in Kansas City, an industrial film company, actually. And after 10 years of working for that company, he felt frustrated and thought that he should really give his art career a chance. So he started drawing underground comics and fanzines. Eventually, he found out about Warren Publishing and tried to work for them. They were doing black and white comics, Creepy and Eerie and Vampirilla. And this was a perfect match for his interest, as we mentioned earlier in the Graham Crackers sponsorship mention. You know, he had a fondness for Edgar Allan Poe and for Lovecraft and for that kind of material. And he did a bunch of stories on spec, and but they never picked it up. You know, Warren never, thought he was publishable, or he was somebody that they thought that they would want to hire. But eventually, he persevered, and James Warren he met James Warren at a science fiction convention. And Bill DeBay, the editor, was there, and they relented and started sending him scripts. And after he finally got his foothold working in comics, he decided to quit his full-time job working for the industrial film company and devote all of his time to drawing. And he was not only was he putting himself on the line by doing that, but he had a family at the time. He had a wife and a young daughter. So this was a really big move for him. But the underground comic surge spread to Europe, and requests to reprint Corbin's underground features began to appear. His character Den became popular, and he went on to get stories published in Metal Hurlant, and then that came back to America as Heavy Metal. But eventually, the undergrounds did begin to diminish, and he started his own company, Fantagore, publishing a lot of his own comics through Fantagore. But the business wasn't enough to support that, and eventually he ended up working for mainstream comic publishers here in the United States, like DC and Marvel, and then of course Dark Horse, who he's worked for pretty consistently for the last few years. But again, other than Warren and Creepy and Eerie, and other than Metal Hurlant and Heavy Metal, he drew several arcs or he drew an arc in Hellblazer. He did a Cage with Brian Azzarello, as mentioned. He did a series for Hellboy, which I think was written by John Arcudi. He did Ghost Rider, and then again, for Dark Horse, Lovecraft, and Edgar Allan Poe for Haunt of Horror, and Rat God, which is out and available now. And I know it's going to come up in the episode, but for you old school heads who are out there, Richard Corben painted the cover for Meatloaf's "Bat Out of Hell." Yes. And it is a fantastic cover, and it is definitely Richard Corben in all of his
glory,
his zaniness, his glory and his zaniness, for sure. But I guess we're going to start what we normally do, talking about our first exposures to his work.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay. Adrian, I know you're champing at the bit, so I'll let you go ahead and go first. How about that?
Man, yeah, let me get in. Okay. All right. My first exposure to Richard Corben's work actually was not a favorable one. My first exposure to him was...
Wait a minute. As many of your first exposures are. Go ahead.
At least you haven't thrown his books away or anything, or given away.
But no. My first exposure to Corbin was like in the cheap bins at the shop. There was like a reprint, like a single issue reprint of one of the Den series. And I remember picking it up and at once being intrigued, yet repelled.
Yes.
Like, what? I don't understand. It seems I might like this, but I don't get it. It's too grotesque, too weird looking. It's not clean to me. So I put it back. And then a few years later, another shop that I was going to, the owner there, or the manager there rather, said, "Hey, you know what's really good right now? Check out this paperback of Hellblazer Hard Time, by Richard Corben." I was like, "Oh, okay." And the manager had good taste, so I had completely forgotten about Corben,
right.
My first experience with him.
Right.
And I picked up that paperback, and man, that's one of the few comic books that has that really just genuinely scared me. It scared me. Mm-hmm. There's a portion where in the last chapter of the book where John Constantine takes over that prison, and he's been doing odds and ends of magic and deception to work his way around the complex and survive. But when he finally unleashes this final act and takes over this prison, oh my God, it is horrifying. And then you come to this one full-page splash of him. He's made the electric chair in the prison his throne, and his crown is the little electrode that you put over.
Yes.
He's just sitting there smoking.
Yes.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
Jeez.
Just Adrian, reading that issue, I remember reading it, and it kind of because I read it, way later after it came out.
Yeah.
It reminded me of that crazy manic scene at the end of Natural Born Killers.
Yeah.
Where the prison's going crazy, and Robert Downey Jr., I think he ends up getting offed by one of the inmates, and it was just like chaos, and it was like, wow, it was just really unnerving because you really, literally, they put you in the film, they put you in the belly of the beast, and that's kind of how it felt at the end of that Hellblazer issue, man.
Exactly. So I was like, oh my God. And anything that can make you feel that visceral, you got to go back and check out the rest of it. That's what put Corbin in my mindset in terms of, let me go back and see what else he has. And since then, I've been a dedicated fan, man. Yeah. I have a burgeoning collection of his work, man. So he's one of my favorites now. Period. So that's my first, experience with Corbin stuff.
Definitely. D, what about you, man?
It's a strong experience, man. I had a couple of experiences with him. One was Well, of course, the most important initial one was his poster for Heavy Metal the movie, where he did Den, the first Den, because there's several Dens, but the first Den is what matters. And
I did.
The first Den was going to be the poster, and then of course Chris Akilos came out and ripped it, and he said, no, Chris Akilos, we have to have you on there. Plus, this is a little tamer by comparison to Den's poster, because Den of course has he's holding the big scepter up with the Lochnar in it, but So that was my first reaction. That was my first reaction to Den. My first reaction to Corbin was like, wow, this guy's stuff so hyper real, so dramatic, and so imposing, and like you feel like you're being sucked into the world almost instantly with this stuff. But then my second, somewhat around the same time reaction after reading Heavy Metal magazine was seeing that Bloodstar series he had inside. Yeah. And there's this really crucial point that set him aside for me as far as being a kind of a horror fantasy artist, and that was when there's this African tribe that has captured one of the neighboring tribes, and he's roasting a woman on the spigot, and they're talking back and forth about
wow.
Yeah.
It's gross. They're talking back and forth about what's the best part to eat, and it's a real close up shot of this guy, real close up shot of the African tribe member with it's black and white though. It's not like Corbin. It's just black and white dramatic Corbin stuff. It's not like the color stuff. And you look at him, he says, I think I will start with the thigh, the thigh. And it just freaked me out. I was like, oh, this is so gross and disgusting. But of course, you want to see what happens. You want to see what happens next, But yeah, varying other incarnations of his stuff too I like. But those two were my first, formal impressions that still weigh on my psyche.
Yeah, yeah. I think for myself, man, certainly I would see his stuff in Heavy Metal, and I was completely repulsed by it.
Really?
I mean, absolutely. I was just like, I would skip over it.
Would you really?
I would look for the Mobius, thing, or the Jeffrey Jones thing,
or the Joulet.
Yeah, whatever else. Milo Manara, Guido Craypox, whatever it was. Anything other than Corbin. It was just too bizarre and just too otherworldly. And it just threw me. And I was just like, and even when I saw the movie, I was like, oh, this is that guy from the fucking book. It just was not my cup of tea. And I don't quite know why that was. It just was. But anyway, probably later on, when he started doing like covers here and there, I'm trying to think of some other things that he did, other than the real comic stuff he did later on. But anyway, it doesn't matter. Hellblazer came along, and I was like, and I think because I was familiar with the character of Constantine, and that world, that made it a little more palatable. And I was like, okay, I can kind of get with it. I kind of see what he's doing. And at that particular time, of course, he had, his style had, he was definitely laying it in the cut a bit, because he was working on an established book that wasn't his characters, wasn't his properties, it wasn't his world, it wasn't a fantasy world.
Right.
And then after that, Cage, I was like, oh, I'm kind of with this, And then I just became kind of a fast fan of the older stuff. Then I could go back and really appreciate the older stuff. But I think it was just weird because initially looking at his work, it was almost like a throwback to like the EC Comics days. I was like, if this dude had been around in the 50s, he'd been right there with Angelo Torres and Johnny Craig and
Graham Ingalls.
Yeah, and Wally Wood and all of those cats. Man, he'd have been right there with them,
Yeah.
So it was really just you have to, I guess, start where you can and then, maybe go back or whatever. But ever since Hellblazer and then Cage and then, all the stuff he's done after that and all the Dark Horse stuff, it's one of those things where I just pick it up. Whatever it is, if I see his name, I buy it.
Absolutely. Off rip.
Just on name alone. And it's funny because I was telling Adrian earlier today when we were talking, I was like, man, I was just looking online at some of those Rat God covers. I mean, Richard Corben is in his 70s, and he is taxing so much modern comic artist ass.
He really is, man. He really is.
He's just laying waste to some dudes, man, and
man.
some girls. Sorry, ladies. I don't give a fuck, boo.
Wow.
Now, let me ask you guys this.
Okay.
I know it's not so in Dee's case, but in the case of myself and Swizz and perhaps other people, I wonder if the first experience with Corbin stuff, that feeling of being repulsed a bit, is because, is it possible for something to be almost too original, like wholly original, that you don't have like a preset notion to even grasp at, how to, take this, I think that's what hits you. It's just like, wow, this is just hugely original, in terms of where he's coming from. And, you can guess at his influences, but you might be wrong. You know what I'm saying? Like he's one of those artists where you almost can't tell who his influences are. It's like what Swizz says all the time. When you read a Richard Corben comic or look at a piece of his art, you are looking at the world through his eyes, through his colored glasses,
Oh yeah, definitely. Man, I just say to add to that, man, would be that when it comes to Richard Corben stuff, man, you're looking at the hyper real, but at the same time you're also looking at kind of like this armature, wherein his figures never quite move right. The ones that aren't muscular don't really move right. They're kind of like puppets, like their legs swing freely. Mm-hmm. And then they kind of
I know what you're saying,
they kind of flail sometimes. So the fact that he renders so well and so tightly, and his volumetric changes from light to dark are so very apparent, that's what helps his work, along with the fact that he's got this penchant for detail, Mm-hmm. But that's why when you guys said you were reading and looking at Luke Cage, I couldn't get into Luke Cage, because Luke Cage, to me, it was like he was kind of like almost aping his style, like he was kind of caricaturing what he did back in the 70s and 80s to me.
I found it completely palatable. Like to me, it was the fact that it was okay. He's not painting; it's just black and white. It's just brush and whatnot. And he was, you got to think, okay, Cage, that was 15 years ago.
Yeah, 2002.
So he was like in his mid-50s probably at the time, early mid-50s at the time. And it just seemed like he was just in complete control of his powers and his facilities. And like to me, and I realize this is in direct contrast to your experience, D, it almost seemed like he was like, all right, man, I
got this.
Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and just do this little Luke Cage thing. And you know what I'm saying? Like it was just effortless to him. It was like, this isn't a challenge. Mm-hmm. This isn't a challenge to me at all. But perhaps it was. But I just totally got it. And it just, once I got that, and it's funny because I didn't really like Azzarello's writing on the book.
Yeah.
Because he wrote so specific, like in terms of like street talk. Mm-hmm. I'd have to read it twice to figure out what the hell he was trying to say.
Yeah, he mentioned that before.
Yeah, and I was just like, okay, man, just you don't have to write. I'm gonna get I if you say I'm gonna, I know. Okay, they're not speaking in the King's English. I get it. But I just absolutely loved it, man. I was just like, okay, all right, this is cool. This is a different thing too.
And and that's a good point, as far as like with Cage and a lot of his other comics work of the last couple of decades, and I'll say even before that, when he draws people, he is adroit at drawing different ethnicities, and the figures. Even though his figures, they're almost wholly cartooned in the sense of they're not 8 heads high. Or I'm sorry, they're not 10 heads high or your traditional
John Buscema style.
Exactly. They look like little miniatures almost. Yeah. But within that, he handles the ethnicities, the expressions that people do, and he makes you feel like that they're like regular people almost.
Not like Michael Golden, not afraid to draw unattractive people.
Yeah, exactly. And in fact, that's one of the reasons why I appreciate him so much is he's willing to go there. he's willing not to draw just, the pretty, the pretty side of everything. Sometimes you got to go to that dark underbelly.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? To really bring out, all of the varying emotions of a story.
Yeah.
Sure. Only when those two extremes exist do you have like a palpable reality to me. You have to have the ugly, you have to have the pretty, you have to have the dark and the light to make necessary transitions to make it work.
Yeah. I want to suggest, too, for anybody who's unfamiliar with his work and is interested, and even somebody who is familiar and has maybe is more familiar with the latter-day stuff that we mentioned earlier, seek out his book, A Boy and His Dog, based on the story by Harlan Ellison.
Yeah.
That's wonderful. Wonderful. It may be called Vic and Blood. Vic was the main character's name, and Blood was the name of the dog.
Yeah.
But it's A Boy and His Dog, and it is absolutely wonderful. It is excellent, and it's kind of a hybrid between being, it's kind of a dystopian future or a post-apocalyptic future, but it's also very kind of like, eye level. It's not really fantasy per se, but it does have some fantastic elements to it because Vic and his dog Blood communicate telepathically. But I definitely recommend that. And if you have ever seen the movie with a very young and Randy Don Johnson in it, check that out too. As well. But as far as his style is concerned, obviously you've got cartoony Richard Corben with the underground comics and the fanzines and that stuff. You've got kind of a painterly Richard Corben, which he still paints to this day, but the heavy metal poster that D is referencing and the stories he did in heavy metal were painted, right?
Yes.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Most part.
But I mean, in terms of his style, what do you guys think are some of the hallmarks of his visual vocabulary that really make him be the unique individual that he is?
The idiosyncrasy of his style, just in terms of he was always willing to experiment, and even through the experiments, he came up with several processes that had never been introduced to comics before him. Foremost being the airbrush. I think it was Will Eisner or Neil Adams mentioned like he brought the airbrush to comics, and revolutionized like comics coloring. I mean, here's this guy out in Kansas City airbrushing these underground comics and coming up with like coloring processes that nobody even thought of before, even in New York, with the big two publishers.
Here's the direct quote, Adrian. It's actually Harvey Kurtzman.
Oh, okay, thank you.
He said, Corbin's technique introduced the airbrush to comics. His sophisticated knowledge of how color is printed allowed him to get fantastic results. His work has maintained a sense of humor and spectacle in tales of barbarians, time travelers, and Arabian Nights. So you're exactly right.
I mean, you're right. He had to do like his own color separations and everything, man.
Yep.
Like literally, he had to buy a photomechanical separation equipment so he can take separate films and piece them all together and send to the publisher, send to the printer himself. So the colors were right. I mean, what person? I mean, these days it's all Photoshop. It's a layer. So, but back then, who has the time to do the work and then on top of that, make sure the color separation is done right so you get the right registration for your work?
Yeah.
That was one of the hallmarks for his work too, man, for me, because it was like, his stuff always had a certain kind of polish and definition to it that was beyond those others that were inside the book.
Absolutely.
I mean, you get the reprints of the French stuff from Metal Hurlant in there, and you can see how the color separations weren't quite right in certain areas. Like you see how, on Lieutenant Blueberry or Arzak, how the color would kind of bleed over in the wrong area when it wasn't printed right. His stuff was never like that. His stuff was always like that's why it was the go-to for me in a lot of cases, because it was just like, wow, this stuff just pops off the page. It's 3D before there was 3D.
Yeah.
And speaking of that, D, also there was a story that he did in the actual heavy metal magazine called Doom's Cult. And what's unique about this story, if you guys look it up, he actually used all photos, but in using those photos, he actually went in and painted over the photos. He exaggerated some of the expressions and the figures a bit. And so, in a way, all of his techniques back then anticipated Photoshop. Because you look at it now, if you look at it now, it's like, wow, this guy was thinking on some other level, man. You
does,
know,
man.
it's a crazy story. Like he was actually using photos. And he made these maquettes. That's another skill of his. You know, he's able to sculpt as well. So he would sculpt his characters as reference. You know, and it's just he's just a renaissance man of just getting his vision out there, his own vision. You know, he's a master of his own vision. That's probably the best way to put it.
Yeah,
I agree with you.
yeah.
Even if it means a sense of repetition and of his own vision to a point where he gets to a perfect point, you know, where it's, you know, din 1, din 2, din 3, you know, that whole thing where it's the same story told over again, but through a different generation of that family, you know.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, he's I don't know. I mean, he really, really, really is a one of a kind, and you know, it's one of those things where you know they don't really make them like that anymore. I don't know. I don't know if they do, yo. And he in terms of style, and also just in terms of being an innovator and being somebody who, for whatever reason, you know, his skills, his the content he's drawn to, his approach, whatever it is, being a painter or being a cartoonist, what have you, you know, he falls in a very, very elite category alongside guys like Will Eisner, alongside guys like Alex Toth to a certain extent, where, you know, Will Eisner, you know, he did a contract with God. He had to have been in his late 50s.
I think so.
Maybe 60 years old.
Yeah.
You know, who as someone who is already a star in their industry reinvents their industry, reinvents or reinvigorates the medium at almost 60 years old? Who's working today that's going to do that, you know, in 20 years?
It's true.
I don't know. And, you know, you're talking about Richard Corben. This is something, and I brought this up on the show before, but it's more appropriate to highlight here. You know, I was a big fan of the spirit in as it was being published in Warren.
Yeah.
It was just so weird and just so odd. And then Warren was so weird and odd. I was just like, okay, whatever. And I remember there's an image. It's a cover from one of the spirit issues where he's running down an elevated subway track.
Yes.
The train is coming right behind him.
Yeah.
And Denny Colt is, you know, his hat is almost flying off of his head and his tie is flying over his shoulder and his arms are flailing. And he's trying to get out of harm's way. And it's painted and it's beautiful Will Eisner artwork, but it is fully painted. And I remember way after the fact, maybe in the last 10 years or so, I looked and I was like, Richard Corben painted this? And that's when I realized how old he was. And not that he's old per se, but I didn't realize he had been working for as many decades as he had. You know, this was published in the 70s?
The early 70s.
Early 70s?
Yeah.
And I was like,
when you go when you go back and look at the first incarnation of Din, man, with Neverwhere, and you look and see he made a film on it before it was even a freaking series.
Oh yeah. That's awesome.
That just blew me away. And the sad part about it, but the good part about it, at the same time, to his credit and to the producers of Heavy Metal's discredit, is his segment was better than what was an actual movie, theatrical feature that came out in the 70s, in the 80s, I should say. Yeah. Far better as far as the intent and the overall construction of the characters to me. You know,
I mean, I remember me and two of my friends went to see Heavy Metal at the Westgate Theater.
Yeah,
and we saw it twice because there were boobies in it, so we were like, "Oh, okay."
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
But yeah, just like it was crazy. But yeah, I mean, he really is just a unique character, and you know, he not unlike I'll go ahead and throw it in there. He not unlike a guy like Michael Golden. With, you know, the idea of, again, you know, they don't always draw the most flattering, attractive people in the world. Not that they cannot, but that they're able to do that and do that effectively and make, you know, their worlds have a certain kind of variety that you don't normally see in comics. But, you know, Richard Corben is another elite group he's going to make you work for it. You're not going to pick up a Richard Corben comic right off the gate and be like, oh yeah, I'm on board, you know. Probably not.
Right.
You know, I mean, you're going to have to work for it, and you're going to have to, you know, you're going to have to settle on, you know, again, seeing the world through Richard Corben, colored glasses, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
So, as far as the work is concerned, do you guys have a favorite work by Corbin, or a favorite image? Even I definitely have to say for myself that spirit image, even though he didn't draw it, he just painted over Will Eisner's his sketch.
Mm-hmm.
It's still one of my very, very favorite images because it illuminated me to his prowess and certainly his the length of his career. But
Yeah.
what about you guys?
Excuse me.
I don't know.
Gosh.
That's hard for me, yo.
Man, it's funny, as big of a collector of Corbin as I am, and having gotten the chance to get a lot of his single issues, his undergrounds, as well as his original graphic novels, this may seem like a weak answer, but now in my head, almost all of it, you know what I mean? Just it's because there's always something in all of his issues. I tend to think more of like his. I have favorite single stories by him.
Mm-hmm.
Like there's a story in his undergrounds. There's one called Sidopey, Cidopey, and it's about these two little creatures. Male and female version of whatever this species is, some made up species. And they're frolicking through this imaginary, forest and everything, just living, actually, having sex. They're in love. They're in love. But these strange, almost giant beings come down and, just wreck the whole thing. And they end up dying. And it's touching because you find out that these giants are actually humans. And it's just these little organisms, and these guys are just these little organisms running around, and you feel touched because the female ends up dying, and so the male counterpart, he goes through these emotions and everything, and the coloring on there is just fantastic. It's fantastic. These fluorescent magentas and these fluorescent greens and everything. And it's just it's a great story, man. And Bloodstar with just that black and white artwork is so rich and so wrought and just really sells the point. The original Den stories, Neverwhere, that's also good.
Yeah.
He just really draws you in. These unorthodox camera angles that he's attempting. The coloring, again, is so rich. It's just, I almost can't choose a favorite Richard Corben story because now, as an advanced collector and just a bit with older taste than I was, as a younger guy, I see something to merit in almost all of it. I mean, even the stuff that people wouldn't necessarily, count, as being his best, I still love it. I still love all of it. So that's my answer as far as like favorite Corbin. All of it.
That's a bit of a cheat, but I'll allow it.
Yeah. I just want to hose the whole area down, machine gun style.
Street sweeper.
Tech 9.
Take that.
What about you guys?
For me, man, it's a little more. I can narrow it down to two images. Of course, the aforementioned Den cover, the aforementioned Den poster we did for Heavy Metal. Yeah, it's probably one of our first initial impacting, image of him. And there's another one he did for the interior of a Heavy Metal magazine. Was an interview he did for called Richard Corben Interview by Brad Balfour.
Oh,
and it's this image of a muscular dude up front who's got cybernetic implants in his body, which allow him to be a better warrior, with a woman standing behind him with big bassoons supporting his arms.
Right.
And they're standing in front of this orange sun. And
I know what you're talking about. They had like these helmets.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, yo. And it's a powerful, provocative image, man. And it's Corbin wasn't afraid to elicit sexuality along with other dynamic things that were very visceral to go along with it. So I just say that's probably one of his more evocative images for me that I liked. It wasn't solely based on like scaring somebody either, or disemboweling or leading up to some kind of Edgar Allan Poe-esque type of conclusion or manifestation. So Yeah, I mean that's those are my two images, but definitely the one I mentioned laterally as far as the cyborg couple, is one you guys got to see if you haven't seen it already.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
It's fantastic.
I think for myself, man, I think my favorite thing, and it's more recent, but I like it because I like the series and I like the fact that one creator was able to really kind of show off and show all of the things that they do well,
Mm.
and that was his issue of Solo for DC Comics.
Yeah. Yeah.
If you go back to that issue, I mean, it's not, just a complete show off like Darwin Cook's issue was, where it was just like, okay, wow, let me just show you how I just Mac everything. but it was the idea of you being able to see him handle superhero stuff, horror stuff, adventure stuff. He told every kind of story, and he told them all through, again, the lens of the world as he sees it. And I'm a big fan, for whatever reason. He's not a great character, but I've always liked the Spectre.
Yeah.
I always liked the idea of the right hand of God is running around exacting these really horrific revenges on people. Like in the Adventure Comics, Jim Aparo and
Michael Fleischer.
Michael Fleischer.
Yeah.
But his version of the Spectre was just fantastic, and again, the cover of his issue of Solo was this bizarre, cyclopean creature with this eyeball in the middle of his forehead, and and it was all this white in the back, so it was just all this negative space, and it was just like, okay, if you're willing to turn the page of this cover and look further, you're going to get some goodness. But again, you're going to have to work for it. I'm not going to hand it to you.
Proceed at your own risk.
Yes, yeah. Exactly. And his issue and Darwin's, and there's one or two others that are really my favorites. I have the collected edition of Solo, and his is one of my very, very favorites. For sure. So
he often thanks Mark Chiarello for bringing it back into comics too, man. Because without Mark, he would have just stayed in obscurity with his Fantagoras stuff to some degree. Not necessarily obscurity, but in terms of his pursuing his own vision,
right?
Which after a while wasn't fully panning out the way he wanted it to. So
right. Yeah. And I think in addition to Mark being a big fan, it certainly wouldn't be. We would be remiss in skipping over the fact that. Editor Scott Alley over at Dark Horse is a huge fan of Corbin's work. I actually hosted a panel that Scott was on when he was in town at DragonCon one year. This is probably 4 or 5 years ago.
Yeah.
And in the middle of the panel, he just went on and on and on about being such a Richard Corben fan, and like it was almost like that was his mission once he became an editor and had the ability to hire people that he wanted to hire to tell the stories that he wanted to tell, and he immediately hired Richard Corben. And I remember when we first started talking about, man, let's see if we can get Richard Corben on the podcast and interview him. And I contacted Scott, and he remembered me, and we talked online, and he said, Richard is just I don't know if it's fair to call him a recluse. He just doesn't really care for interviews or to put himself out there in a certain way, let's say, because he does do interviews. He does more print interviews than anything else.
Yeah.
But it's largely in concert with the release of something he's got, coming out. And I think he probably does it as just being loyal to his publisher and wanting to promote the book and, for the book to do well.
Mm-hmm. Now, in that regard, Swizz, you're talking about, him being kind of reticent about doing interviews. Mm-hmm. There's a great book I have to recommend that people pick up if they're able to find it. It is a bit rare. That's Richard Corben, Flights into Fantasy.
Oh, yes. Mm.
It's a hardcover and written by Farshid Barucha. Okay. I was able to get a copy of it for just $24 on eBay, actually on Amazon about 5 years ago.
Right.
And oh my gosh, it's the best. I mean, it's published in 1981, and it's a retrospective of his work up through that year. And excuse me. Edit that out, please. It's a retrospective of his
it's my new
work.
ringtone. Go ahead, man. It's a retrospective.
All right. It's a retrospective of his work up through that year of 81, and it shows all facets of his work, from the not just the comics work, but also his paintings that he was doing for paperbacks, paperback novels and such, those album covers like the Meatloaf you mentioned at the top.
Mm-hmm.
And also it shows where he was sculpting these maquettes, and and it goes into like some of his personal life too, as far as like some of his backstory. He actually gives comments in here about his process and everything, and it's just a great find if you can acquire it somehow. So I definitely recommend that if you want to round out your Corbin collection and find out a bit more about him.
Now, I got a question for you in that regard, Adrian. In regards to that book, does he do an excerpt of that on his website? As far as there's an excerpt from a nice interview that he did with this guy that was very, very precise and asked him really intricate questions about his style and his process and where he came from and all that stuff.
I know the one you're talking about, and I think if you go back and look at the one on the website now, he actually says that's one that he specifically did for the website. Okay. Because I think he's reticent about doing interviews, and he wanted kind of a catch-all, So reading through the whole thing, you do get kind of a breath of how he goes about certain things, but not in particular with him using like the processes of the time. Like Flights into Fantasy gives a complete breakdown of his coloring process. Like he gives a step by step. I airbrush the cyan sheet first. I do 10% fill on this. Like he really breaks it down. And do you know that this man said, Corbin said, yeah, you can airbrush almost anything. You can even run oil through an airbrush, but you just have to be really, really careful. Airbrush with oils? What?
Yeah.
Isn't there a drying issue with oils?
But it just goes to show you that he was just fearless in about how he would just try and experiment in all these ways to bring his vision to life, man.
I wonder how many airbrushes he screwed up with that, man. Because trust me, he wasn't using an Illustrator airbrush. He's probably using a Pache or something like that. The Illustrator airbrush that's designed for fine lines, it's not going to take well to oil at all, bro.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's interesting. That's cool.
Yeah.
We mentioned earlier that Richard Corben in 2009 won the Spectrum Grandmaster Award, but he's won an Eisner Award for his Hellboy story. He won a Shazam Award, and he is in the Will Eisner Award Hall of Fame, or he was elected to the Will Eisner Award Hall of Fame in 2012.
Yeah.
So he's one of those where we say he's unsung. He's definitely sung, if you will, in terms of his peers and in terms of industry people and people who, work in the trenches alongside him and know the quality of the kind of work that he creates and know the kind of creativity that's at work there. But he's never been a fan favorite, I don't think.
No.
You've got guys like, Frank Miller and Crumb and Mobius. They're all fans of his. But I don't know if, even though he did Hellboy, which is a very popular character to a certain extent, and, Hellblazer and others, he's never been a fan favorite for whatever reason. So,
Right. Like you'd have to be in the know to know who he is in a way, because if you're just coming in off of just the street and just trying to pick up a Corbin book, you might be repulsed at first, like we kept mentioning,
Yeah. Yeah.
But I mean, one of our past guests on the show, Brad Rigney, is a big fan of his, and it shows. It just shows in his work and his choices too, in terms of what he did in his earlier work. So,
most definitely. A couple other quick quotes too that are kind of interesting is Will Eisner said, "Corbin's work is singular in its humanity. He works with towering technical skill. The wondrous thing of it all is that underneath all of that technical tour de force is the sound of a beating heart." And Mobius said, "Richard Corben stands among us like an extraterrestrial peak. He has sat in his throne for a long time, above the moving and multicolored field of world comics, like an effigy of the leader, a strange monolith, a sublime visitor, a solitary enigma. That's the shit, yo.
It really is. It really is.
And can I add a quote by Neil Adams?
Yeah.
He has developed processes and methods of reproduction that make his work something that nobody can even try to imitate. Most of us can't even conceive of doing as much work as he does.
Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, he definitely is the guy. I think that again, one of the things that always surprises me is the fact that he is in his 70s and continues to work. But going back to the idea of him being, hesitant to, to come to the fore and kind of being content to just kind of, humbly do his work and do it with excellence. One of the things that I found interesting is looking for photos of the man. Anything you find of him is just a rare kind of a Polaroid or a very small JPEG.
Like he's Citizen K, yo.
Yes, yo. he's the Garbo of comics, man.
But again, in that Flights of Fantasy book, they have a photo gallery of him from when he was a little child all the way up to as he was in 1981. And get this, a lot of people may not know is that he was actually pretty stacked, Joe. You think
he was Scott Diesel, yo?
He was, yo. Like he was like, man, all right, shit. Okay, using yourself as reference, man.
Yeah. Like in that Neverwhere movie he did, he played the goofy, skinny, artist worker that has his Flights of Fantasy, takes him to Neverwhere.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But you're right, he's actually bigger than that, man, than when he shows himself to be in that movie. So
yeah. Because there's a picture in that heavy metal interview he did with Brad Balfour, the infamous interview.
Yeah, exactly.
There's a picture of him sitting on this weight bench with these weights behind him. He got on this red T-shirt, Joe, chest all guns just yeah,
guns are blazing.
Yeah, yo. So I'm like, oh shit, okay, all right.
Well,
but
go ahead.
I'm sorry, D.
I see what else is cool though, man. Also, if you really want to see a more up-to-date image of what he looks like now as he's older, his wife is actually a photographer / artist herself, and he has a link on his website, his main website now that displays her work. And of course, me being one of those delving type personas, I look deeper and deeper and deeper to what was behind the curtain of what was what she was doing.
Yeah, and deeper.
Right? And she took a photograph of him that's of a much more mature age than he is now. It's a really good one. It's a side profile. Looks good. He's matured well for his age, so it's kind of interesting to see and kind of cool too.
And also elaborating upon that, man. Every time we've gone to Spectrum in the last couple of years, man, I know that he's there in Kansas City, and every time we've gone, I've always tried to look up his picture just so I can have like a reference of, okay, that's kind of what he looks like. I had this fantasy that he was there at Spectrum, but he wasn't heralded in a way. It's like, hey, everybody, it's Richard Corben. Like he was just walking through, and then I would maybe see him like, that's Richard Corben, yo.
You know what? If that were to happen, I have full faith that Kathy and Arnie would be like, oh my God, Richard Corben is here.
Surely.
Oh my goodness. Oh my damn. Well, to that point, as I am wont to do, I was scouring the internet for pictures to use as to go along with the blog entry for this podcast.
Yeah.
Right.
And it's going to end up being one of 2 self-portraits that he painted of himself.
Yeah.
Okay.
You know what I mean? Because those are really the things that are out there that that you can kind of get your hands on, and they're both excellent.
Once I show you this picture he did, not to interrupt you. Once I show you this picture his wife took of him, you may want to use that too. It's really good.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
I definitely remain open. So, any last and parting words as far as the great Richard Corben are concerned from either of you guys?
Yeah. If I may. So anyone who has tried to get into Corbin, try it again, because I guarantee that your initial response probably was not a favorable one. But I think if you go back and try, excuse me, I think if you go back and try, start with his recent stuff. That should probably be a bit more accessible, just in terms of it being closer to the comic stuff that one is used to, and then work your way backwards. But if you can, try to look for his undergrounds like Rolf, Up from the Deep, several of those. Now it's expensive. Here's the other thing about Corbin. He is a very expensive proposition to try and collect. Hugely expensive. But yeah, he's worth it. If you can get your hands on those originals, like I've actually had to get his stuff in book form, but also in digital form. So I'm like Corbin down. You know what I'm saying? But yeah, if you can pick up any Corbin, it's worth your time.
As Adrian pointed out, with the collector's price, maybe on some of these items. As I said earlier, he's going to make you work for it.
Work 40 hours a week for it.
Figuratively and literally.
Right.
Man, what about you, D?
Man, interesting enough, I'm going to take the reverse of that. I'm going to say if you want, I suggest you try again with Bloodstar. Go back and pick up some of the early heavy metal issues. If you want to go back as far as heavy metal issues, even go to some of the Epic Comics issues. He did an interesting story in an Epic, a very short-lived series that Marvel put out under an imprint that was produced by or edited by Archie Goodwin, where he did it was kind of an anthropomorphic story where it was animals that were in human form but had more humanist than animal to them. And they were kind of like in a Planet of the Apes type manner. They were taking over the world, but it was done in a way which was colored, but it was extremely hyper colored, but it was done in Corbin style. And it's a fantastic, interesting read, and I'd say a romp through his skill set and what he does, man. So I say start from the beginning to some degree. Like his stuff is just so rich, man. You can't not like deny this man's ability to take orange and blue together and make that shit work.
Yeah.
His stuff is just, I mean, it's stark and it's angry but it's all like liquidy, and loquacious, So I would do that.
Yeah,
that's me.
I would definitely recommend, like I mentioned earlier, Boy and His Dog. I think that's a pretty seminal work. A lot of the latter stuff I think is fine. Like Adrian said, it's certainly a bit more palatable. And the idea that he's actually rendering characters that you're familiar with may make your entryway into Corbin a little bit easier. Also recommend a Rip in Time.
Yeah, with the dinosaurs and stuff.
Yeah, almost kind of like a Time Cop kind of a thing that he did, and it was published by Fantagraph, his own company. Back in the day, and Bruce Jones wrote it, and I remember, having a couple issues. Though I don't have them anymore.
Oh man!
But I do remember. Yeah. But I do remember reading those when I was a kid as well. But really, anything like Dee said, anything you can get your hands on. His work is so rich and it's so wonderful, and it will literally transport you somewhere else. So, there's a continuum that goes back to, the underground fanzines and Den and Metallica Law and so forth, and then moves forward all the way to Rat God and, and Cage and Ghost Rider and the other stuff. So, I mean, anywhere you start should probably be okay, but, if you have any trepidation, definitely, I'd say start at the contemporary stuff and maybe work your way backwards, but, Whatever will get you there.
Right. And I do have one other thought about Corbin. Yeah. The fact that he's one of those examples as well of I forget which artist this original quote was attributed to, but I think it was Mobius who said, "I lead a mundane life so that I can draw unmundane things." And that's what I feel is the thing with Corbin. You look at his pictures, look at photos of him, if he can find them, or just descriptions of how he goes about it. And he's very matter of fact about it. I just draw and paint for a living. That's it. But the material that comes out of him is just like extraordinary, and it's just something else. So I think there's some truth to that. That concludes this episode of Sidebar Forever, hosted by Dwight Clark, Swain Hunt, and Adrian Johnson. You can find us online at sidebarforever.com. Any emails or questions can be directed to us at sidebarforever@gmail.com. And also, subscribe to us on social media. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and Instagram. Sidebar Forever is copyright 2020. Dwight Clark, Swain Hunt, and Adrian Johnson.